December 16, 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes lay silent under a heavy winter sky. American troops, scattered across thin defensive lines, stamped their feet against the bitter cold, their breath rising in pale clouds. For weeks, they had believed this was a quiet sector of the front, a place to rest and refit. At dawn, that illusion shattered. Without warning, the stillness was torn apart by the thunder of over 1,600 German artillery pieces. The largest barrage the Western Front had seen roared across 80 miles of forest. Trees splintered, foxholes collapsed, and men dove for cover as shells churned the frozen earth into fire and smoke. One American infantryman later recalled the ground trembling so violently that it felt as if the whole forest was coming down on top of us. From the thick fog emerged the spearheads of Hitler's last great gamble. More than 200,000 German soldiers, backed by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, surged forward in a massive surprise offensive. Panzer divisions rumbled down narrow forest roads, while infantry swarmed through the snow-draped pines. The German High Command called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. To the Allies, it would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The American defenders were caught unprepared. Many belonged to inexperienced divisions, newly arrived and poorly equipped for winter warfare. Their positions stretched thin across the dense woods, leaving gaping vulnerabilities. German troops poured through the fog, cutting communications and overwhelming forward outposts. Eyewitnesses described scenes of chaos. Convoys jammed narrow roads, retreating soldiers stumbled through waist-deep snow, and young officers struggled to form coherent defenses amid the confusion. "We didn't know where the enemy was coming from," one GI later wrote. "It felt like they were everywhere at once." Hitler had chosen his moment carefully. The Allies were convinced that Germany was near collapse. Paris had been liberated in August, and the drive toward the Rhine seemed unstoppable. In this atmosphere of confidence, the Ardennes, with its rugged hills and dense forests, appeared an unlikely site for a major German assault. But Hitler saw opportunity. His goal was audacious: to split the Allied front, drive to Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West, allowing Germany to concentrate its dwindling strength against the Soviet Union in the East. The weather played into his hands. Heavy fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, denying the U.S. and British armies their most powerful advantage: air superiority. On the ground, the Germans pressed forward with ruthless determination. Villages that had been peaceful the day before erupted into close-quarters firefights. American machine gunners fought from basements and barns, holding off advancing columns until their positions were overrun. Civilians huddled in cellars as tanks clattered past, their homes reduced to rubble. In the first hours of the offensive, entire American units were surrounded and cut off. Thousands would be taken prisoner in the days ahead. Shock spread through the Allied command. Reports of massive German movements seemed unbelievable. Many officers dismissed the first messages as exaggerations. Only as the scale of the assault became clear did the true danger emerge. By nightfall, the quiet Ardennes had transformed into a battlefield of smoke, fire, and desperation. Roads once used for supply columns were now clogged with retreating vehicles. The forest, blanketed in snow, echoed with the clash of tank engines and the crack of rifles. The Germans had achieved total surprise. Yet amid the confusion, there were glimmers of defiance. Scattered American units dug in and fought with tenacity, slowing the German timetable. Isolated pockets of resistance clung to crossroads and bridges, forcing German armor to detour and buying precious hours. These small stands, made in the freezing cold by men with little food or ammunition, would prove vital in the days to come. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with fire and thunder, throwing the Western Front into crisis. For the Americans on the ground, it was a sudden plunge from complacency into catastrophe. For the Germans, it was the desperate gamble of a collapsing empire. And for the world, it was the opening act of the last great battle in the West, a struggle that would determine how and when the war in Europe would end. As the fog of battle thickened across the Ardennes, the broader purpose of the German attack came into focus. This was not a local counterstrike, nor a desperate spoiling action. It was Adolf Hitler's final gamble in the West. The Führer envisioned nothing less than a decisive reversal of fortune. His objective was audacious: to split the Anglo-American armies, encircle and annihilate them, and then drive swiftly to Antwerp, the vital Belgian port supplying the Allied advance. By cutting the Allies in two and capturing their lifeline, Hitler hoped to force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. In his mind, such a blow might buy Germany time to regroup against the advancing Soviet tide in the east. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its success hinged on three elements: complete surprise, rapid movement, and weather that would keep Allied aircraft grounded. For once, the weather cooperated. The winter of 1944 brought dense fog and heavy snow that cloaked German movements and silenced the skies. Command of the operation fell nominally to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, though Hitler himself dictated its design. Under Rundstedt, two of Germany's most formidable field commanders carried the burden of execution. SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich, leading the 6th Panzer Army, was tasked with striking the northern shoulder, spearheaded by Waffen-SS armored divisions. To the south, General Otto von Manschaufel's 5th Panzer Army would attack with precision, cutting through thin American lines and driving toward the Meuse River. The 7th Army guarded the southern flank, ensuring the thrust remained intact. In total, nearly 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks, assault guns, and armored vehicles were hurled into the attack. Facing them were fewer than 90,000 Americans spread thinly across an 80-mile sector, many of them replacements barely acclimated to combat. These men believed they were in a quiet area, far from decisive action. Their commanders, too, assumed the Ardennes were unsuitable for large-scale armored warfare. German preparations were meticulous. Supplies were stockpiled in secrecy. Troops were moved under cover of night. Even the most senior Allied intelligence officers failed to predict the scale of the assault. Complacency reigned. In Washington, London, and even Eisenhower's headquarters in Paris, the assumption was that Germany no longer had the strength for a major offensive. Yet within the German ranks, optimism simmered. Diaries of officers spoke of a final chance to change destiny. One panzer commander recalled briefing his men that they would be home by Christmas once Antwerp fell. But beneath the bravado lay desperation. Fuel reserves were critically low. Ammunition stocks were barely adequate. The operation required lightning speed. Any delay risked collapse. On the American side, confusion reigned in the first days. Orders were contradictory, communication lines severed, and reinforcements slow to arrive. A young U.S. officer later remembered the shock of hearing reports of German armor breaking through everywhere at once. "No one believed it was possible," he wrote, "until the enemy was at our doorstep." The disparity in expectations could not have been greater. The Germans believed their surprise would fracture Allied resolve. The Americans, unprepared and understrength, clung to scattered positions, improvising defenses as best they could. Both sides knew the stakes were immense. The Ardennes had become more than a battlefield. It was the stage upon which Hitler wagered the survival of the Third Reich. The gamble was reckless, but in December 1944, the outcome was far from certain. And as German armored columns pressed westward, the fog of war deepened, setting the stage for one of the most brutal and costly clashes of the Second World War. While German armored spearheads carved deep into the Ardennes, their timetable was already beginning to unravel. Central to the plan's success was speed, the rapid capture of key road junctions that would allow panzers to race toward the Meuse River and, eventually, Antwerp. But two names, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, emerged as immovable obstacles: St. Vith and the Elsenborn Ridge. St. Vith, a modest Belgian town, was a vital crossroads. Whoever held it controlled the arteries of movement through the dense Ardennes. On December 17, 1944, the U.S. 7th Armored Division, supported by fragments of battered infantry units, dug in against relentless German pressure. The defenders, short on supplies and with little time to prepare, faced the armored might of the 5th Panzer Army. The clash quickly became one of attrition. German tanks rumbled into narrow streets, only to be ambushed by bazooka teams firing from basements and rubble. A soldier later recalled that every house became a fortress, every wall a barricade. For 5 days, the Americans clung to St. Vith, fighting block by block in the freezing cold, as shells reduced the town to ruins. To the north, the Elsenborn Ridge loomed as another critical obstacle. It was here that American artillery made its stand. Elements of the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, considered inexperienced by their adversaries, turned the ridge into a fortress of firepower. German panzer divisions hurled themselves at the heights, confident that weight of armor would shatter the line. Instead, they were met with a wall of steel. American artillery batteries, firing around the clock, devastated German formations. "The ridge shook under our guns," one U.S. gunner wrote, "and still they kept coming." Yet the ridge held, and with every failed assault, German momentum bled away. Conditions were brutal. Snow fell in heavy sheets, masking movement but also freezing men in their foxholes. Visibility was poor, and nights were lit by burning vehicles, their flames crackling in the frigid air. Survivors on both sides described the smell of cordite mingling with smoke, the cries of the wounded echoing through shattered forests. German paratroopers, advancing through drifts of snow, stumbled into machine gun fire, while American defenders endured artillery that churned the ridge into a wasteland. At St. Vith, the battle reached its breaking point. By December 23rd, encircled and out of ammunition, the U.S. 7th Armored Division withdrew under cover of darkness. Yet the delay they inflicted was decisive. The German advance, already slowed by poor roads and supply shortages, had lost precious days. St. Vith was a thorn in our side, one German officer admitted after the war. "It cost us time we did not have." On Elsenborn Ridge, the defense became a symbol of grit. Despite repeated attacks, the Americans never relinquished their ground. The ridge denied the Germans access to roads leading west, funneling their advance into narrower corridors and sowing chaos in their plans. The cost was staggering, for both attacker and defender, but the stand at Elsenborn represented one of the few times in the Ardennes where American forces consistently stopped German assaults cold. These battles, overshadowed by names like Bastogne, were no less significant. They were roadblocks, stubborn, immovable, and costly, that transformed Hitler's gamble into a desperate slog. St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge proved that the German timetable, so essential for victory, could not withstand the resilience of determined defenders. And as the front froze into stalemate in some sectors, the attention of the world shifted southward, where another town, Bastogne, was about to become the epicenter of defiance. As the German offensive pressed deeper into the Ardennes, the town of Bastogne became the heart of the struggle. Situated at a vital crossroads, 7 major roads converged there, making it indispensable for any advance toward the Meuse River. To lose Bastogne meant surrendering mobility. To hold it meant blocking the German timetable. By December 20th, 1944, the town was surrounded. Inside the encirclement stood the 101st Airborne Division, veterans of Normandy and Holland, reinforced by remnants of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units. Their commander on the ground, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, faced a grim reality. Supplies were critically low. Ammunition was rationed, medical stocks nearly gone, and food stretched to the thinnest margin. Bitter cold turned foxholes into icy graves, and men wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find to stave off frostbite. Snow fell relentlessly, muffling movement but also deepening the misery. For the paratroopers, daily survival was as much a battle as resisting the enemy. One soldier scribbled in his diary, "Our boots are frozen, our hands useless. The cold bites worse than the Germans." Yet the Germans pressed hard. Artillery pounded the perimeter, sending geysers of snow and dirt into the air, while panzer units probed for weak points. Nights were filled with the thunder of barges, the sharp crack of rifle fire, and the cries of the wounded carried through the forest. On December 22nd, German envoys arrived under a white flag. They carried a formal demand for surrender, warning that if the Americans did not yield, Bastogne would be destroyed. McAuliffe's response, scrawled on a slip of paper, was one word: nuts. The reply baffled the Germans, but when translated by the Americans into plainer terms, its defiance was unmistakable. Word spread quickly through the frozen foxholes. For the exhausted defenders, that single word became a rallying cry. As one paratrooper later recalled, "We knew then we weren't giving up. If the brass said nuts, then so did we." Meanwhile, the situation grew desperate. Casualties filled makeshift aid stations where medics worked without morphine or bandages. Frostbite claimed as many men as shrapnel. Sea rations ran out, and soldiers resorted to boiling snow for water. Yet still the lines held. Machine guns rattled through snowstorms, and tank destroyers ambushed panzers that attempted to breach the ring. Bastogne had become a fortress of willpower, defended not by abundance, but by endurance. The weather, cruel though it was, also favored the Germans, at least at first. Low clouds and fog grounded Allied aircraft, preventing vital resupply missions. But as Christmas approached, the skies finally cleared. C-47 transport planes roared overhead, parachuting supplies into the besieged town. Bundles of food, ammunition, and medical kits drifted down on white parachutes, bringing a moment of relief to the weary defenders. The angels from the sky, as one soldier called them, kept Bastogne alive. The defense of Bastogne was more than symbolic, it was strategic. The crossroads denied the Germans the mobility they so desperately needed. Every day the 101st held out was another day the German offensive slowed, another chance for Allied reinforcements to arrive. And those reinforcements were on the way. General George S. Patton's Third Army, executing one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, wheeled northward in a blizzard to relieve the town. But before relief came, Bastogne had already written itself into history. Surrounded, starving, and frostbitten, the defenders refused to surrender. Their resistance turned a small Belgian town into a legend, a testament to endurance under impossible odds. As Patton's columns fought their way closer, the fate of Bastogne hung in the balance. The siege had become the very soul of the Ardennes battle, and soon, the relief effort would bring a dramatic turning point to Hitler's last gamble. While Bastogne froze under siege, salvation was already moving. In mid-December 1944, General George S. Patton received Eisenhower's order: relieve the encircled town at all costs. Patton, never one to hesitate, stunned Allied command by declaring he could pivot his entire Third Army northward in just 3 days, a maneuver that would normally take weeks. He had been preparing contingency plans in advance, and now he unleashed them. On December 19th, the order went out. Columns of armor, infantry, and artillery swung like a massive steel pendulum, shifting 90 degrees in the middle of winter. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of Sherman tanks, and miles of convoys had to turn, regroup, and advance through blizzards, iced over roads, and mud that clutched at their treads. One officer later wrote that the line of trucks seemed endless, stretching beyond the horizon, their headlights dimmed against the snow-laden night. For the soldiers, the march north was grueling. Engines froze in sub-zero temperatures, and tank crews struggled to keep their vehicles running by lighting fires under the steel hulls. Infantrymen trudged forward in knee-deep snow, their breath steaming in the air, frost collecting on rifles and helmets. Supplies were scarce, and the men lived on cold rations as they pressed forward, step by painful step. Yet morale remained high. Patton's reputation as a relentless commander inspired his troops to endure what nature and the enemy conspired to throw against them. As the Third Army advanced, resistance stiffened. German forces, realizing the threat to their encirclement of Bastogne, hurled infantry and armored units against Patton's spearheads. Villages became battlefields, with stone houses shattered by artillery and streets clogged with burning vehicles. One tank crew recalled fighting through a hamlet where the snow turned black from soot and red from blood. The weather remained both enemy and ally. blinding snow slowed movement, but it also concealed American advances. At the heart of this drive was the 4th Armored Division, tasked with punching the decisive hole toward Bastogne. For days, they battled through ambushes, minefields, and icy terrain. Progress was measured in yards, each mile bought with casualties. Still, the men pressed on, knowing that every step brought them closer to their trapped comrades in Bastogne. Letters and diaries from soldiers at the time reveal a shared determination. We had to get through, no matter what. Bastogne was counting on us. By Christmas, the pressure grew unbearable. The defenders inside Bastogne endured relentless bombardment, while Patton's men fought mile by mile toward them. Finally, on December 26th, after days of punishing combat, tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through German lines and rolled into Bastogne. Exhausted paratroopers, gaunt from hunger and cold, greeted the tank crews with cheers and tears. Relief had come, not as total liberation, but as a lifeline that changed the course of the battle. The arrival of Patton's forces did not end the fighting in the Ardennes, but it marked a turning point. The German timetable had collapsed, their offensive momentum blunted. The encirclement of Bastogne was broken, and from this moment, the Allies began to push the enemy back. Patton's maneuver became legend, a feat of command and coordination that military historians would study for decades. But for the soldiers in the snow, it was more than history. It was survival. The relief of Bastogne had proven that even in the darkest winter of the war, American resolve could not be broken. From the frozen roads of Luxembourg to the shattered crossroads of Bastogne, the tide of the Battle of the Bulge had begun to turn. The German gamble was faltering, and soon, the Allies would seize back the initiative. As December drew to a close, the weather finally shifted. On December 23, 1944, the fog that had blanketed the Ardennes for weeks lifted, and with it came the full fury of Allied air power. For the Germans, the sky's clearing marked the beginning of the end. Thunderous roars filled the frozen air as waves of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and RAF Typhoons swept overhead. Fighter bombers strafed convoys caught in the open, their .50 caliber rounds stitching through trucks and horse-drawn wagons alike. Columns of black smoke curled upward as fuel dumps erupted in flames, while precision strikes shattered bridges and crossroads, severing already tenuous supply lines. One American pilot later recalled the sight of German vehicles burning for miles, as though the roads themselves had caught fire. For the Wehrmacht, the blow was catastrophic. Their armored divisions had pushed deep into Allied lines, but their advance relied on fuel captured from enemy stockpiles. As airstrikes tore apart convoys and depots, fuel shortages crippled their mobility. Tanks that had once spearheaded the offensive now sat abandoned, half buried in snowdrifts, their engines frozen and their crews retreating on foot. A German officer grimly noted that, "Our tanks became fortresses without wheels." By the turn of the year, the tide had unmistakably shifted. Patton's Third Army pressed north, Montgomery's forces countered from the north, and American units across the salient stiffened their defenses. The German offensive, once a spear poised to split the Allied front, had dulled into a pocket of exhausted divisions, struggling simply to hold ground. The toll on both sides was harrowing. Soldiers advancing through the Ardennes in January described a landscape littered with corpses frozen solid where they had fallen. Burned-out half-tracks, shattered artillery pieces, and wrecked panzers lined the roads, stark reminders of the ferocity of the struggle. One American infantryman recalled that the snow was red in places, black in others, and white nowhere. Despite the horror, morale among the Allies rose steadily. The successful defense of Bastogne, the return of air superiority, and the relentless counterattacks all signaled that Hitler's grand gamble had failed. German divisions, stretched thin and drained of resources, could no longer replace their losses. In contrast, Allied supply lines flowed freely once more, delivering food, ammunition, and reinforcements that revitalized weary frontline troops. By mid-January, the German salient, the Bulge in the Allied line, was shrinking under constant pressure. The once confident vision of reaching Antwerp had dissolved into a desperate retreat. The last major offensive Hitler would ever launch in the West had collapsed, leaving behind over 100,000 German casualties, including tens of thousands captured, along with irreplaceable tanks and aircraft lost to the snows of Belgium. For the Allies, the victory came at a steep cost, nearly 90,000 casualties, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement fought by American forces in World War II. Yet it was also a vindication of endurance. The defenders who had held at Bastogne, the artillerymen who had blunted panzer assaults at Elsenborn Ridge, and the infantry who trudged forward in January had collectively broken the back of the German counteroffensive. As January 1945 drew to a close, the Ardennes lay silent once again, its forests scarred by shellfire and its villages reduced to rubble. Hitler's last gamble had ended not in triumph, but in ruin. The road into Germany now lay open, and the Reich's collapse was only a matter of time. The Ardennes, once meant to be the graveyard of Allied hopes, had instead become the burial ground of German ambition. The Bulge had collapsed, and with it, the last illusion that Nazi Germany could turn the tide of war. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Ardennes forest bore scars that would never truly heal. Snow still blanketed the hills, but it was stained with the wreckage of war, blackened tank hulls, shattered helmets half buried in the ice, and countless graves marked hastily with wooden crosses. What had begun on December 16th as Hitler's bold counteroffensive had ended as a ruinous defeat, and the echoes of that struggle would resonate long after the last shot was fired. For the United States, the Battle of the Bulge was both a catastrophe and a testament. Nearly 90,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or captured, including more than 19,000 dead, the bloodiest battle ever fought by U.S. forces in World War II. Infantrymen who had survived spoke of frostbite and starvation as often as they did of combat. One paratrooper later reflected that the cold was an enemy as cruel as the Germans, but unlike them, it never stopped attacking. The Germans suffered even more. More than 100,000 casualties, along with thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft, were lost in the Ardennes. These were reserves Germany could never replace. Hitler's gamble, meant to split the Allies and capture Antwerp, had instead drained his armies of their last offensive strength. By spring, the Reich would face relentless Allied advances from both east and west, with no ability to recover. The battle's toll fell not only on soldiers, but also on civilians across Belgium and Luxembourg. Villages were shelled into rubble, homes burned, and families forced to flee into the freezing forests. Survivors remembered trudging through snow with nothing but what they could carry, while artillery thundered in the distance. For them, the Ardennes offensive was not a grand strategy, but a season of terror that left their communities scarred for generations. Yet, within the horror lay stories of endurance. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne had held firm against overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. On the Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery crews broke the back of panzer assaults. At St. Vith, stubborn defenders delayed the German timetable long enough for reinforcements to arrive. These pockets of resistance, strung together across a frozen battlefield, became the backbone of eventual victory. In the years after the war, veterans of the Bulge often spoke of it as both nightmare and triumph. Many could never forget the sight of comrades frozen in their foxholes, or the relentless sound of shells crashing through the forests. But they also remembered the unity forged in that crucible, the way exhausted soldiers dug deeper than they thought possible. The phrase, "Remember Bastogne," became shorthand for courage under impossible circumstances. Strategically, the Ardennes offensive delayed the Allied timetable, but only briefly. Instead of dividing the Allies, it strengthened their resolve. Instead of buying Germany time, it accelerated its defeat. The Wehrmacht never again mounted a major offensive on the Western Front. The Ardennes had consumed their last reserves, and with them, the last illusion of victory. And so the forest, once quiet and unassuming, became immortalized in memory. The same trees that had echoed with the thunder of artillery now stood as silent witnesses to sacrifice. Memorials rose across Belgium and Luxembourg, not only for American and German soldiers, but also for the civilians caught in the storm. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge was clear. It was the last desperate gamble of a collapsing Reich, and it was where American resilience and Allied unity proved unbreakable. What began with fire in the forests of December 1944 ended in silence and ruin, a silence that still hangs over the Ardennes today. In those snowbound woods, Germany's last gamble was played and lost. The echoes remain, of frozen footsteps, defiant cries, and the cost of a war that left even victory draped in grief.